Dear participants, dear guests, nice to see everybody here. And we are starting the second round of our international conference, the Crossroads of Mythos and Logos. The conference dedicated to works of Algis Myckūnas, and first speaker, Naglis Kardelis, with the paper Inevitability of Classical Philosophy and Contribution of Algis Myckūnas.
Dear colleagues, participants of this conference, venerable professors, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to be invited to this conference and celebrate the legacy of Algis Myckūnas, one of the greatest contemporary Lithuanian philosophers. His ideas and charming personality is a powerful source of inspiration for many generations of intellectuals, both here in Lithuania and all over the world. Without his pervasive presence and informal influence, our philosophical and cultural life is simply unthinkable. Always radiating with happiness and sheer joy of life, Algis is perhaps the happiest philosopher on earth, and his joy and happiness, along with his wisdom and friendliness, are the key to his exceptional charisma. Some time ago, I compared Arvydas Šliogeris, another prominent Lithuanian philosopher, to Socrates. Classical scholars divide ancient Greek philosophy into the pre-Socratic and post-Socratic periods. In a similar way, we may divide Lithuanian philosophy into two periods: Lithuanian philosophy before Arvydas Šliogeris and Lithuanian philosophy after Šliogeris. In this sense, the philosophical thinking of Šliogeris constitutes a watershed in Lithuanian philosophy, similar to the pre-Socratic and post-Socratic divide in ancient Greek philosophy. But Arvydas Šliogeris is not the only Socrates in Lithuanian intellectual life. Algis Myckūnas is another one. In practical terms, Algis is even more similar to Socrates than Arvydas Šliogeris, and even Socrates himself would have envied such great number of disciples as Algis has. Algis lives in Athens, Ohio, and is professor at Ohio University, Athens, and even this circumstance is very symbolic and invoking the resemblance to Socrates the Athenian. The untiring quest for truth and the spirit of dialogue, along with zest for life and incomparable personal charisma, are the features of those two philosophers, the Greek Socrates and the Lithuanian Socrates, who resides in Athens, Ohio, that are essential to understanding the spiritual affinity and the enigma and the majestic force of their personality, majestic and magnetic force of their personality. Algis Myckūnas is a contemporary philosopher, one of the most prominent Lithuanian and American phenomenologists. Yet the spirit of classical Greek philosophy, especially the spirit of Socratic inquiry, pervades his entire thought and philosophical writings. The philosophy of Algis Myckūnas, as that of Socrates and Plato, is free, always searching, enigmatic, and open-ended. For Algis Myckūnas, philosophy is not a form of ideology whose positions should be blindly defended at all costs. As we know, the most important difference between philosophy and ideology is that philosophy engages in investigation, dialogue, and negotiation, while ideology simply pontificates and blindly defends some final truth. In the sense of freedom of thought, Algis is a latter-day ancient Greek philosopher of Lithuanian descent. In my view, the most important contribution of Algis Mickūnas to philosophy is the ingenious reconciliation between classical philosophy and contemporary philosophy, especially phenomenology, realized in his writings. While most contemporary continental philosophers still engage in the critique of Greek metaphysics, Algis Mickūnas argues that our return to classical philosophy is inevitable, yet this return should be accomplished on our own terms. In a sense, postmodernism, with its distrust of objective truth and reality, that is viewed as non-constructive, is self-defeating ideology and self-defeating philosophy of the past. And despite being younger, classical philosophy is much younger, and postmodernism is antiquated philosophy with respect to ancient Greek philosophy. Despite the fact that postmodernism is perhaps 100 years old and even less, a few decades old, it is an antiquated philosophy, and ancient Greek philosophy is much younger in a spiritual sense, so to speak, despite being 2.5 millennia old. And the contribution of Algis Mickūnas is also related to the fact that he shows the relevance of classical philosophy to our practical endeavors and our everyday life. While classical scholars simply engage in formal investigation of Greek philosophy and they research into Greek philosophy, Algis Mickūnas practices ancient Greek philosophy, especially Socratic philosophy, and shows that classical philosophy is a living force in our philosophical life, not only the object of academic research. In the writings of Algis Mickūnas, the classical Greek thought becomes a real presence of our intellectual life and our own quest for truth. I would also like to draw your attention to the difference between Hodos and Methodos in ancient Greek philosophy. And the difference between those two modes of thought are very important in the writings of Algis Mickūnas, in his way of thinking. Hodos in ancient Greek means the way, the road, and Methodos is the road that we follow. The road that is already made, already laid down, and we simply follow this road. So we have Hodos as our own way, and a free way that we follow, and Methodos is a way that has been laid down, and that we simply follow. So we have sort of binocular vision made of two perspectives. One road is Hodos, free road, free way, and the other way is Methodos, that we simply follow. And as a phenomenologist, Algis Mickūnas has his own method, his own version of phenomenology, but he also practices his Greek Hodos, his vision of his way, mode, and vision of free thinking. Free thinking that is similar to ancient Greek thinking. And this unity of Hodos and Methodos is, so to speak, a Methodos of Algis Mickūnas, his methods, philosophical method, which is both free, open-ended, and at the same time it is informed by phenomenology, by phenomenological method. And this ability to to find a holistic solution of uniting Hodos and Methodos is the hallmark of Algis's thinking. And this ability to unite Hodos and Methodos is characteristic also of Plato's way of thinking. In Plato's dialogues, we find that both free thinking in terms of Hodos, in the mode of Hodos, and methodic thinking. And for example, Plato is the initiator of hypothetical methods. Hypothesis as a method is practiced by Plato for the first time in Greek philosophy. But Plato also uses his free mode of thinking in terms of Hodos. And Algis and Myckūnas also is a virtuoso of Hodos and Methodos, free road and method. Algis and Myckūnas is one of the most prominent Lithuanian and American phenomenologists, but he might be viewed as an admirer of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and as I said, he's ancient Greek philosopher of Lithuanian descent, latter-day ancient Greek philosopher. And now I want to turn your attention to the sculpturality of Greek thought, and I will argue that Algis's thought is also imbued with such stereometric, those stereometric features that are the hallmark of Greek thinking. The ancient Greek sculpture is viewed by many art historians as disclosing the essence of Greek artistic genius. I would like to observe that the sculpturality or multidimensionality is the most prominent feature of classical philosophical thinking. The ancient Greek philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, used to think in such a way that their thoughts were formed, figuratively speaking, as sculptures that should be viewed from various angles. The sculpturality of thought means that the philosopher himself or herself shows both the advantages and disadvantages of their expressed philosophical opinions, thus escaping the peril of bias and one-sidedness. Even the structure of Greek sentence shows this sculpturality, this multidimensionality. When forming a sentence, the ancient Greeks used two particles, men and death. And those two particles have the effect of saying on the one hand and on the other hand. When expressing some proposition, they at the same time the Greeks show this sentence, these propositions from at least two angles, and one angle shows the advantages, the other angle, the other perspective shows the disadvantages of this proposition. So the proposition in the process of being said, of being expressed, is shown from two angles, from the angle of advantage and from the angle of disadvantage. And in this sense, we might say that the ancient Greek philosophical thinking is a form of 3D thinking. It's a form of stereoscopic, stereometric thinking. And their thoughts are sculptural, not thoughts that are expressed one-sidedly. And such sculpturality of thought is also typical of Algis's way of philosophical thinking. And as a phenomenologist, Algis Myckūnas invokes the notion of the temporal thickness. Therefore, he adds yet another, the fourth dimension, to his sculptural thoughts. And therefore, I would characterize his thinking as four-dimensional or 4D thinking. The concept of temporal thickness that enables the past moments to appear in the present moment and to shine through the surface of phenomena is a novel approach in phenomenology and a very significant contribution to contemporary phenomenology and philosophy in general. The ancient Greek philosophers would be very happy to have such a concept at their disposal in their philosophical repertoire. The temporal thickness accounts for the perceptual intensity and sheer force of phenomena in the process of their appearance. For different temporal sections of a given phenomenon are viewed simultaneously at the moment of the phenomenon's appearance. And I would say that the temporal thickness accounts for hyper-sculpturality, so to speak, in our grasp of phenomena. And having in mind the Greek fashion to think sculpturally, Algis and Myckūnas employing this notion of temporal thickness and achieving the hyper sculpturality of thought in his writings and speaking, develops the classical sculptural mode of thinking even further. I see that I have no time left, but I perhaps will stop here. And I would also like to say that Algis's thought is very important in the sense that he develops the dialogue between Western and Eastern philosophy, and he assimilates the Eastern Asian thought into Western philosophy. The philosophy of ancient China, Japan, and India, and he employs those Asian ways of thought, not decoratively, but very organically and holistically interweaves those Asian modes of thinking into Western way of thinking, to speak Greek way of thinking in his understanding. So Algis's philosophy is important in fighting Eurocentric superstitions, at the same time guarding the most important aspects of Greek philosophy. Thank you.